I'd like to introduce Dr. Ronald Stram, who is a board-certified emergency medicine physician and the founder and medical director of the Stram Center for Integrative Medicine. During his time as an ER doc, Dr. Stram recognized a need for a new medical approach to reduce the debilitation associated with chronic disease, often seen too late in the emergency room setting. So he completed a fellowship in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona Health Science Center, and his integrative practice now sees patients from all over the country and overseas. Dr. Stram?
Welcome, everyone. How are you all doing? Is y'all okay here? We're in the south, sort of. Let me see if I can do that. You can't hear. Okay, I will grab the mic. So I'm going to kind of take it down a notch, just because I think a lot of this is very scary, all this stuff about bugs and bad guys trying to get you. So I'm going to talk about something very dear to my heart, or my gut, and that is about the microbiome. So one of this is really trying to understand what the microbiome is, the interplay between nutrition and the microbiome, chronic illness and the microbiome, and the impact of the immune function and inflammation associated with chronic illness and the microbiome. Mitigating symptoms with microbiome manipulation, how dietary intervention, the microbiome manipulation, and exercise can reduce disease, and how the microbiome itself can be seen as an organ and also as an endocrine organ. So what I'd like to say is this is a new scientific forefront. We are only at the beginning of understanding the importance of the microbiome, not as a collection of individual cells, bacteria, fungi, but altogether as a vital organ that has as much to do with our health and balance as the heart and the brain. So microbes are often seen as the bad guys. We heard of all these bad guys. Like all of them, Babesia, Bartonella, Lyme, they're all trying to get you. But in actuality, less than 1% of the microbes in our body are pathogenic. So what about the other 99%? So that's what we're going to talk about, is the other 99%. And the fact that it's not just the bug, but it may be the context of the other bugs around it that make it virulent. So H. pylori, in the setting of children, when eradicated, increases the likelihood of asthma and respiratory infections. Without certain bacteria in your gut as a child, you may have long-term consequences. So I'm here to kind of not only think outside the box, but actually think inside the gut. So yes, we have 1 trillion cells in our body. And actually, we have about 2 to 3 trillion microbes. And it's not just that we have 2 to 3 million microbes. These microbes have their own genomic expression. So we have 27,000 genes in our system. But we have 500 times that gene expression with the microbes. So what you are genetically is as important as what your microbiome makes it out to be. So our bacteria in our microbiome are essential. E equals MC squared, which means they extract energy from our food. They produce essential vitamins. They regulate our immune system, so all this autoimmunity, this immune dysfunction, over 70 to 80% of it begins in your gut, your Peyer's patches, which are in your small intestines. That's why you can have a colectomy, take out your big, large intestines, but you can't touch your small intestines. because that's where this occurs. It regulates our glucose levels, our metabolism. It protects us against disease causing microbes. So what I'm here to tell you is it may not be the next best drug. You may actually have the bacteria in there, and how do we make it work better? Because it's symbiosis. When we look at an ecosystem in a forest, one that is diverse tends to do well. One that has an overgrowth of certain species tends to not do well. And in fact, Sloan Kettering is doing a research on this, looking at patients that undergo bone marrow transplants. Now, bone marrow transplants is a very invasive procedure, has a very high amount of mortality and morbidity associated with it. Well, one of the preconditioned tests that they did on their patients receiving bone marrow transplants was looking at the diversity of the gut flora. And if the diversity of the gut flora was high and active, mortality dropped and morbidity dropped. So one of the ways that we may be looking at to test is to actually test the microbiome before we even start treatment. So more on microbes. Microbes actually, I believe, they're like the general contractors. They kind of tell your body what to do, how your body organs develop, how you smell, behave, even how much fat you store. They provide us access to plant nutrients and enable us to break down food. In the absence of microbes, food supply chains would break down, precipitating the extinction of nearly every species within 1 year. So I'm here to tell you, most of these bugs are good. Many conditions, including obesity, asthma, colon cancer, autism, are accompanied by changes in the microbiome, suggesting that these microbes are at the very least a sign of illness, but maybe the direct cause of it. So this is a really excellent book if you want to look at for looking at the microbiome. Similar to Mary Beth Pfeiffer, Ed Young is a scientific journalist, and he really has culled a lot of the research that I'm talking about regarding the microbiome. And what he discusses is how complex and vital microbes are in sculpting our organs, defending us from disease, digesting our foods, activating our genomes, and grant us incredible ability to stave off disease. Microbes carry millions of gene-making systems that make them the ability to change and rapidly be influenced by our environmental factors. They can digest foods and break down toxins. They can attack and kill other microbes they deem dangerous. So much of this research, and the research that Karina Al-Azal has done, is the use of gnotobiotic mice. So gnotobiotic mice are mice that are basically bred without microbes. Now, one would expect, you would think, because we're hearing all this stuff about these bad bugs that try to kill you, and that these bugs must be really, these mice must be like super mice. They must be super healthy. But in fact, they are not. They're in fact very sick. Their bones break easy. They can't gain weight. They're jittery. They're anxious all the time. They seem moving all the time. And so, but they tend to be really good models for looking at how the influence of changing their microbiota actually changes their health condition. So this experiment used fecal microbiota from humans. And it took 3 sets of humans. It took normal-looking, normal-appearing humans that had no real health conditions, obese humans, and obese people that actually lost weight. And when they, when they did that, they found that the gnotobiotic mice became the condition of their host's microbiome makeup. And I believe this has major implications for our health. So I think that one of the issues here, and some of you people probably know this and you've probably experienced it yourself. I don't know, I tried this diet and I exercise and I'm eating only 1,200 calories a day and I still can't lose weight. What's up with that? Or I weigh so little, it doesn't matter how much I eat, and I can't gain weight. So the belief is that, again, it is your microbiota. That with people that are obese and can't lose weight, that the microorganisms actually have a leftover of these sugars that they don't digest. They ferment and become these polysaccharides, which stimulate the production of fat cells, creating lipogenesis, or fat cell production. And these increased triglycerides store within the liver, creating what will become fatty liver. Because what happens is not only does it do that, but it reduces your ability to actually break down the fats by reducing fatty acid oxidation. So what happens when we take antibiotics? Do they just kill the good guys and then that's what happens? Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So if we see here is the guy that has been, regular guy, he's got C. diff exposure. But interesting enough, C. diff, in the context of no antibiotics, with a very healthy diet, high in fiber and phytonutrients, has anti-inflammatory effects. So its effects is based on the context of the environment. But now we take this gentleman or gal who's was given antibiotics. Now the bugs that he had that mediated these secondary bile salts would actually act as food for these other bugs to grow and inhibit that guy up there. They now are destroyed, and they don't produce those secondary bile salts, which then leads to decreased competition and increased growth, and it starts to go from there. So I'd like to say that what I believe is the microbiome may be the first non-surgical organ transplant that you can receive without any immunosuppressive medications. Because the gut bacteria actually act as hormone modulators. They are involved in controlling and supporting hormone balancing. So we often know this, but people that are depressed and anxious and autistic children, they tend to have low productions of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And in fact, when we look at it, their gut microbiota is off. And so likely because 70% of the production of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine occur in your gut. Hormone imbalances. And we'll have a case later showing that this is really significant. But hormone imbalances occur, again, the production of estrogens, progesterones, testosterones occur primarily beginning in the gut. And so therefore diseases that are associated, like polycystic ovary disease, menstrual abnormalities, menopausal problems, breast cancer, prostate cancer, all can be related. And correcting this phenomenon of dysbiosis, of a dysfunctional gut bacteria, may be the key at preventing or reversing estrogen or hormonal dominant conditions. And in fact, it's coined a term, endobiome, or the estrobiome, where its disruption is associated with increased risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and osteoporosis. And what we see in endometriosis is these bacteria that are beta-glucuronidase producing bacteria. Now it's interesting because that bug, we don't like that bug, because that bug, what that bug does is it increases the circulation of estrogens within the systems. Because beta-glucuronidase cleaves off one of the coupling mechanisms that gets estrogen out of your body. It's a coupling mechanism and makes it more soluble so it gets out into your stool. But it increases this level, and that beta-glucuronidase we see is elevated is also elevated in colon cancer. So modulation of the microbiota, which what we will talk about later, it's fecal microbial transplant. My daughter, when she saw I was putting this talk on, she said, Dad, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm talking about, stool and, that stuff. And she goes, that's like so gross. I can't believe you would talk about that. And she goes, you're not going to invest in poop, are you? And I said, well, I may, but, And so she said, well, if you do, you make sure you have money for my education. So I just have to make sure I do that. So the association between polycystic ovary syndrome and the gut microbiota. Polycystic ovary syndrome is the most frequent endocrinopathy in women of reproductive age. It's difficult to treat because it's multifactorial, has complex etiology and pathogenesis. Again, using these nodobiotic mice, again, no germs in them at first, now giving those mice increased amount of estrogen. And when those microbiota were given fecal transplants of healthy mice, they did not have symptoms of polycystic ovary disease. And lactobacillus transplantations were also beneficial. So the speculated health implications for the gut microbiota is vast. Obesity, adiposity, diabetes, insulin resistance, systemic inflammation, metabolic symptom, rheumatoid arthritis, cardiovascular disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hypertension, endocrine abnormalities, colorectal cancer, irritable bowels. So, I know we're going to have another speaker here, and I will tell you that I think and I believe truly that food is medicine. And good food is your best medicine. Poor food is a very slow, poisonous death. And unfortunately, in this society, the SAD, Standard American Diet, is the most common diet that we have. What I will show you is that I do believe that everyone in this room, if you look at some diet, and I agree with Rich and everyone here that there needs to be a tailored approach. So not one diet fits all, but that I do believe this makes a big difference. So what do? We got vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, paleo, keto. How do you know which to choose? So what I'd like to show you is some research that's done on a lot of the diseases that are manifest with chronic persistent Lyme disease. Parkinson's, ALS, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, brain fog, chronic fatigue. and how some way dietary interventions alone can make an impact. So anti-inflammatory diet. That's kind of all the rich, beautiful vegetables, the color of the rainbow, of which Tammy put on such a great presentation yesterday, and the food was as welcoming as you can imagine. So a diet of rich and colorful non-starchy vegetables can contribute adequate amounts of polyphenols and help to inhibit the regulatory protein that sort of is the monitor of inflammation. And understanding the impact of dietary interventions on silent inflammation can elevate the status of diet and changes in diet to just a source of food and calories to the cutting edge of gene splicing technology. And in fact, the Mediterranean diet, which is really somewhat like the anti-inflammatory diet, that when people adhered, and this study has been presented since the late 1990s with the Lyon study, which was 600 post-myocardial infarction patients. There was an Italy study that looked at 6,000 patients. But the conclusions of the Mediterranean diet, it has been linked to a significant reduction in overall mortality and morbidity, and that the microbiota of patients adhering or people adhering to that diet reduce their E. coli count and increase their bifidobacteria count. And the opposite is seen when those adhere to more of the fast food diet. Now, bifidobacteria are seen as sort of anti-inflammatory bacteria. But how come there's a population called a Hadza population? It's an indigenous population of hunter and gatherers. They have no bifidobacteria, none in their gut. They have no cardiovascular disease. They have no evidence of any inflammatory disease at all. And in fact, their species in their gut has Vibrio. Vibrio is Vibrio cholera. They have spirochetal species. They have Prevotella, which has been seen in our societies having autoimmune conditions. They have high amounts of it. They have no autoimmune phenomenon. Their diet consists of very high amounts of very starchy foods that typically wouldn't be broken down if we ate it. If we go and eat sushi or go to Japan and eat seaweed, we don't have the bacteria that breaks those down, but the Japanese do. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not necessarily the bugs, but it's the context and the environmental history that you were born in that changes it. So a lot of the patients that we see have MS-type symptoms. If you look at their gut microbiota, they tend to not have high diversity. They tend to have single species that are dominant, more of the inflammatory markers. If we put these people on a ketogenic diet, specifically ketogenic, there is an improvement in their overall outcome. And the total diversity of the microbiome after 6 months changes. Now, this is state-of-the-art medicine. We give someone who has COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and we have them follow a diet high in antioxidants of fruit and vegetables. And their lung volume improves over 3 years. This is a chronic obstructive disease. It tends never to improve. And yet the opposite, if on a standard American diet, goes down. Now, I know we all like our meat, but it may be time to think again. Colorectal cancer is the third most common cancer worldwide. The heme content in red meat is 10 times greater than that of any white meats. And this nitroso compound that is formed from cooking meats, it's not actually the compound itself that's dangerous. It's actually the bacteria that digest it and create this free radicals that increase carcinogenesis. We all like our cheese, we all like our dairy. One can argue that humans shouldn't eat or drink the milk of another animal that weighs 10 times more than us. It doesn't fit. So this article found, this was done actually with the Nurse Initiative that has about 80,000 patients, and they looked at their dietary intake of 80,000 patients. And those that drank low-fat milk, worse, or low-fat cheese or food products that were dairy-based, had an increased risk overall of developing Parkinson's disease. All right, so I bummed you out enough. What are we going to do to, fix it? So what I'd like to say is, and this is really interesting. So this was a study that was done looking at athletes. And these are marathon athletes. And they had these marathon athletes stop training for 2 to 4 weeks before they did this next test, which they checked their microbiome prior. Well, after exercise, one race, a half marathon, they changed their gut microbiota that made them able to digest fats more efficiently. They were able to transfer adrenal hormones like aldosterone, which is the drug Florinef, which is given for POTS syndrome, to make it more active so that they have greater blood pressure, higher input, higher fat cell metabolism. And the specific bug that they found that was elevated in every one of these athletes was Coriobatraceae. And so that may be a bug to look at if people are responding in their health. So the gut microbiome performs nutritional, protective, metabolic functions. Increasing the diversity of the gut microbiome can rapidly respond to altered fecal metabolites by adjusting certain bacterial populations. And drugs do the same. So yes, you got some heartburn and taking Zantac. That may be beneficial for your heartburn, but it may completely change your microbiota and actually make you more susceptible to C. diff infection, make you have a reduction in your ability to absorb vitamin D and magnesium and calcium. But it's given as an over-the-counter drug that people take, like the commercial. I ate bad food, I got a consequence, let me just try to treat it. So this is what my daughter would say is the gross part of this talk. So I figured I'll give it a start. So fecal microbial transplants, they're actually pretty ancient. In fact, the Chinese were using fecal transplants back over 1,000 years ago to treat diarrheal illness. Veterinary medicine has used it for tens of years now, where they would take healthy horse poop and put it into that of a diarrheal affected animal. And Dr. Eisman was a general surgeon back in 1958. And he noticed on his patients they had pseudomembranous colitis. Now that's the colitis associated with C. diff infections. He treated them with fecal microbial transplant enemas for 4 patients. They all recovered. Now, that was about the time that vancomycin was developed. So once vancomycin was developed, unfortunately, there was no other research done on fecal microbial transplant. It was really left as a joke, right? You tell your joke and tell people about fecal microbial transplant. Until 2008. And in 2008, a physician named Koritz, gastroenterologist, was taking care of this 61-year-old woman who was basically dying. She had C. diff infection that was recalcitrant, was not responding to any treatment. She had lost 60 pounds within 9 months. She was in a wheelchair because she couldn't move. She was nutritionally cachectic, just like that she was starving. And she was wearing diapers because she was having bowel movements 30, 40 times a day. So he went up to her and he said, look, I remember reading about this in medical school. Would you be willing to give this a try? And the woman said, look, it's either that or I die. So her husband, who was taking care of her, was very healthy. He actually hadn't not been on any medications, no antibiotics that he had for at least a year. And he ate a very good diet. This was in Minnesota. And they transferred his poop to her. Within 24 hours, her diarrhea stopped. Within 1 month after the transplant, she was disease-free. And when her microbiota was looked at, doing sequencing, it mirrored the same as her husband. And she was disease-free, period. Now, interesting enough, my wife is here, Nadine. At that time, in my practice, someone came to see me. And it was about 2008. And they said, yeah, I know you're a weird doc and you like doing this stuff, so I just want to know, I want to do this fecal transplant. And now, I had not read about it, so I basically went out and told my wife, how could you get this patient in my office? I mean, this is like really nuts. But I didn't. And I listened to her. And I researched on it. And I actually supported her doing this. She had the same issue. She had recurrent C. diff infection. She had a history of colitis, history of ulcerative colitis. She was given a number of antibiotics, and she had developed pseudomembranous colitis, and nothing was working. She did a fecal transplant with her husband. We initiated it, and she's been cured ever since. So, what I'd like to say is that. The only problem is that the drug companies are now getting wise to it, so the next thing you know is they'll do this. But interesting enough, so a study was done in 2013, because right now, in 2013, since 2013, the FDA has proved fecal transplant for resistant C. diff infections. But the study was actually done by a Danish physician named of Keller. And he enrolled 120 patients, all with resistant and recurrent C. diff infections. And he enrolled them, and it was a double-blind study, because you can put poop in a pill, and you can also do I have that too? Let me just see. Oh, that's not it. That was the wrong one. Anyway, you could put poop in a pill, and that's what they did. They had to actually cut it short, because after 42 patients, 94% of the fecal transplant patients were cured, and only 27% of the vancomycin patients. So after 42 patients, they had to cut it short because of ethical reasons. There is nothing in medicine, nothing. We can go around the room. There is no cure rate of 94% that I've ever seen, except for fecal transplant. So my daughter was, she was looking at it, she goes, this is ridiculous, Dad. She goes, you are not going to invest in this, and so that I then will not have my education and my dowry for when I get married. And I said, but wait, Rachel, what are you going to do for the summer? She goes, well, I'm going to work as a waitress, because I need some money, right? I said, well, yeah, you do. I said, but what if you would just donate your poop? And so we looked it up. And if she donated her poop, she could actually make more money than if she was... So what I said was, you know, it may be gold. So what about probiotics? So probiotics, you know, some probiotics, they're told, oh, it's just, they get destroyed in your gut, they don't do anything, they're just, they're not going to help you, it's just, you're wasting your money. Well, this is the Cochrane collaboration. And it's a nonprofit collaboration, which basically looked at probiotics, which can shorten infectious diarrhea, reduce the risk of diarrhea brought about by antibiotic treatments, and save lives from a severe mortality-producing infection that occurs with premature infants called necrotizing enterocolitis. Now, this is very interesting, too, because necrotizing enterocolitis is a devastating disease, and it typically kills the infant. If you give infants bifidobacteria, now bifidobacteria is an anti-inflammatory bacteria. You give them bifidobacteria and mother's milk. Now, the maternal oligosaccharides in mother's milk, guess what? You can't digest them. Babies can't digest them. Well, that's weird. What are they for? They're for to build up your microbiome. So if you give preemie babies, which typically are not breastfed, if you give them maternal milk, they can't digest it. It just goes right out. But if you give them bifidobacteria, they thrive. So bugs are good friends, mostly, right? Diversity. So there are some exciting innovations. And I'm going to say this is exciting. So not only can we look at the microbiome in our own gut, but what about looking at the microbiome of the tick? What about looking at the microbiome of the tick and seeing if you can manipulate it to not make it have these bugs that keep reproducing? Wouldn't that be pretty amazing? Well, actually, this is a phenomenal study that has not been out there. This is Scott O'Neill, and he lives in Australia. And one of his family members developed dengue fever. So he went on a mission 20 years ago to eradicate dengue fever. And what he said was, how do you eradicate it? You have to, like a famous person we know, Jill Auerbach, says it's all about the ticks. Well, it's all about the mosquitoes. So if we can affect the mosquito, can we change its transmission rate? And what he found was in fruit flies that had dengue, the dengue virus in them, if they had Wolbachia, which is the most common bacteria found in arthropods, over 40% of them have it, it rendered the fruit fly unable to reproduce the virus. So what he did was he engineered Wolbachia, somehow through the larval stages, infected the mosquitoes. And this was done in 2011. They have not had one case of dengue fever in Australia since. So what I want to tell you is the Cook Foundation, the Cohen Foundation, this is some of the money that should be going into. So this is also a novel approach to anti-infections. The use of phage technology, bacteriophages, where you actually manipulate the bacteria to actually kill another bacteria. And so this woman has cystic fibrosis. And with her cystic fibrosis, she had Pseudomonas aeruginosa. resistant to the current medication that she was on for the past 9 months. It was aerosolized. What was developed was a phage that particularly attacked the Pseudomonas bacteria. It was a manipulated bacteria that then went after the Pseudomonas. Within 1 month, she was cured. So I'm going to give you some real-life stories here. And these are 2 patients, and I'm going to say that, look, this disease is a really shitty disease. In fact, that's the only quote that I ever was put on paper, I think. And it really is, because it is a multi-system, multifactorial disease that needs a very broad look. And what I really employ is to all of us, Dr. Horowitz, Cameron, all the people that are in this fight, that what we need is outcome studies. We need non-biased outcome studies that look at protocols that Dr. Horowitz has, that I have, that other people have, and do them in a way that is systematic, non-biased, so that we can really look at, if we have 50 patients that go through my protocol, Dr. Horowitz's protocol, Cameron's protocol, who has the best outcome? And I'm going to say, I'm putting it out there, because I do believe that this really needs to be done, because if we don't do this, then we're all in our own little silos trying to figure this out. We all got to be together. So this is Maya. So Maya came to me, I guess about 7 months ago or so. So she was this 11-year-old young lady, and she was chunky. She was quite overweight. In fact, she had gained about 50 pounds in the past year and a half. She also had early onset menses, developed her menstrual cycle when she was 9. That's pretty unusual. Now, as a child, she was pretty colicky, had a lot of intolerances, had numerous ear infections, and was put on about 4 to 6 antibiotics per year for 5 years. And no one ever told her about probiotics or anything like that. And after that, she started to develop these really terrible food intolerances. Nuts, pastas, peas. Now, prior to when she came to see me, she had been a competitive swimmer, was number 3 on her swim team in terms of how fast she was. When she saw me, she could hardly swim. She could swim one length and she would get tired. Now, her diet consisted of the standard diet: pancakes, egg waffles, popcorn, sandwiches, burgers, pasta every night, pasta twice a day, and ice cream. It said occasional, but she actually had ice cream about 4 to 5 times a week. And her main fluids were sugary lemonade, apple juice, and very little water. So we looked at her labs, and basically her labs were normal. And in fact, we did celiac disease profiles, all negative. So it must be in your head. But then we also looked at her histamine. We looked to see if she did have some mast cell dysfunction. And if you see, her eosinophils were slightly elevated, which can be evidence of some mast cell dysfunction. But also she had very high IgE levels. So we knew we were working with someone who had a true mast cell dysfunction. Also, some of her levels were on the low side, her B12, her vitamin D. And as you see, what we talked about, for a child, she had elevated triglycerides. So we did what we called a food allergy, but really it's not a food allergy test. It's more of a food sensitivity test. And we use both IgA, IgG, and IgE testing. And the reason why is IgE is immediate. Most people, now 11 years, you probably know it already, what foods cause illness. But IgA typically occur within a few days to a week later, and IgG can be 6 weeks later. So you can't tell. And you can see that even though she didn't show any problem with wheat, she showed a lot of problem on this test. And dairy and eggs. We see these two as one of the major culprits. So that's why when you tell people to eat a paleo diet or a or a vegetarian diet. Eggs seem like, oh, that's a good idea, and cheese, not so much. So we also looked at just inflammatory markers, but we also looked at her hormones. She had astronomically high estrogen. No, because the next one is really good. Okay. No, come on. All right. So okay, I'm going to try to talk in my New York speed. So basically, she had a lot of hormone dysregulation. She had very high estrogen. She had very low progesterone, and like Dr. Harwood said, she had no cortisol. It was flat. So her get up and go basically got up and went. We basically just treated her microbiome, lots of probiotics. We repopulated her gut with zinc and vitamin A and glutamine. And we basically put her on a Mediterranean-type diet. And basically, within 6 months, she was a competitive swimmer again. She was #1 on our swim team now, and she completely maintained her strength. So again, this is not any antibiotics. But I am going to tell you, the next case is a pretty interesting case. This is Jake. Jake is you see his hands, they look like claws. That's because he came in, he could not touch anything, he could not eat for the past 10 months because his hands hurt him so much. And he was losing weight, and he had migratory joint pain, and he had headaches and night sweats, and he was miserable. He had a tick bite at 8 years old. That was the only recollection of a tick bite. He first came to us with this severe hand pain. And he looked completely, he had lost like 30 pounds. He went to every doctorologist that you know of, and no one could figure out what was wrong with him. We did tick-borne testing, and I absolutely thought clinically that he had probably Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia at the very least, but I felt that his symptoms in his hand were most likely Bartonella-like symptoms. And so we did conventional Lyme testing, which was negative. We did MDL testing, which did come back with some bands, but again, there's some bands positive. We did Accutex, which showed that he had Borrelia miyamotoi, which is a new Borrelia species. But under Accutex testing, all his other co-infections were negative. On MDL, he came back super positive on Bartonella, Lyme, Anaplasma, and Babesia. And all right, now I'm all nervous trying to get this done. So as you see, his Babesia was really, really high, and we did Galaxy testing on him too, and he had super high levels. So interesting enough, and his food, he was just, look at this. Like his gut was just like the kid couldn't eat anything. So we had to really clean up his gut. In fact, we didn't even start treatment on him for about 2 weeks until he could start, and he started to feel better. We just were treating his gut. Now, we started with sort of Bartonella treatment, Biaxin, Rifampin, and Ceftin. And he couldn't tolerate Biaxin, he couldn't tolerate Rifampin, he could only tolerate Ceftin. So then we said, okay, well, let's just do Ceftin and Bactrim. We put him on Ceftin and Bactrim. And again, I'm going to go right through this. He had inflammatory markers, all consistent. I'm just going to keep going there. And he had the cytokines that Dr. Horowitz was talking about, very elevated. So we did this, and he really wasn't making a lot of improvement. He was having some improvement, but then we added hyperbaric oxygen. And when we added hyperbaric oxygen, he went from that which you saw. Okay, I'll try to be really quick on doing this. From that to and I don't know how he's able to do this, but he actually did this pose on the back of a chair. So you can't see it, but he actually did this pose on a chair like this, balancing himself. So he's been pretty much disease-free. So thank you very much, and sorry if I went over.